My name is Detective Sam Thorne, and in my 20 years on the force, I've seen just about every kind of tragedy you can imagine. But this case was different. It started when a journalist named Clara Hensley walked into my office one damp October morning, clutching a folder like it was a lifeline. "Detective Thorne?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with urgency. She was younger than I expected, mid-30s maybe, with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything in the room. "That's me," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "What can I do for you, Ms. Hensley?" She sat down and placed the folder in front of me. "I'm investigating a case from 12 years ago. Richard Lane, convicted of murdering his girlfriend, Emily Price. He confessed, but..." She hesitated, then leaned forward. "I don't think he did it." The name hit me like a slap. Richard Lane. I remembered the case all too well. Emily Price, 22 years old, found strangled in her apartment. Richard Lane, her boyfriend, had confessed after a grueling interrogation. Open and shut, or so it had seemed. "Lane confessed," I said, opening the folder. Inside were photocopies of police reports, court transcripts, and a few grainy photos. There's not much to argue with when a man says he did it. What if he was coerced? Clara shot back, her tone sharp enough to cut through my skepticism. "Look at this." She pointed to a transcript of the interrogation. They questioned him for 16 hours straight. No lawyer, no breaks. They told him they had evidence that didn't exist. And here's the kicker. He recanted the next day, but it was too late. The confession was enough to seal the deal. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. She wasn't the first person to cry foul over a conviction, but something about her intensity made me pause. Even if the confession was shaky, what about the other evidence? "That's just it," Clara said. "There wasn't any. No DNA, no fingerprints. The case rested entirely on the confession. And you think you found something?" She nodded, pulling out a photograph from the folder. It was a close-up of a gold necklace with a small, heart-shaped pendant. This was found at the scene, but it wasn't Emily's. It was logged as evidence, but never investigated. I tracked it down to a pawn shop in town. The shop owner says he remembers who sold it to him. My pulse quickened. 12 years was a long time, but a solid lead was a solid lead. "Who?" "Emily's neighbor. A guy named Paul Hargrove." I frowned. Hargrove had been interviewed during the original investigation, but nothing had pointed to him as a suspect. "Did you talk to him?" "Not yet. I thought I'd bring it to you first," she said. "I've already stuck my neck out digging this up. I need someone with a badge to look into it officially." For a moment, I said nothing, staring at the photo of the necklace. If Clara was right, this wasn't just a case of sloppy police work. It was a potential miscarriage of justice, one I'd had a hand in. "All right," I said finally. "Let's pay Mr. Hargrove a visit." Hargrove's house was a dilapidated one-story on the edge of town, the kind of place where the paint peeled faster than anyone could bother to replace it. Clara insisted on coming along, and I didn't have the heart to argue. If nothing else, her presence might shake Hargrove up. He answered the door after a couple of knocks, a wiry man in his late 40s with watery blue eyes and a nervous energy that set my instincts on edge. "Mr. Hargrove," I said, flashing my badge. "I'm Detective Thorne. This is Clara Hensley. We'd like to ask you a few questions about Emily Price." His face went pale. "Emily? Why now?" "We've come across some new information," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Do you recognize this?" I held up a photo of the necklace. Hargrove's eyes darted to it, then away. "No. Never seen it before." "That's funny," Clara said smoothly, "because a pawn shop owner says you sold it to him." Hargrove's hand shot up to scratch his neck, a nervous tick if I'd ever seen one. I don't remember. Maybe I did. So what? That doesn't mean anything. It means you've got some explaining to do, I said, stepping closer. Why was Emily's necklace in your possession? He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Instead, his gaze flickered to the living room window, as if calculating his chances of bolting. I followed his eyes and noticed a faint smear on the windowsill, red, rusty, and unmistakably blood. "Miss Hensley, step outside," I said sharply, drawing my gun. "Mr. Hargrove, keep your hands where I can see them." Clara hesitated, but the look I gave her brooked no argument. She backed out of the doorway, pulling out her phone to call for backup. Hargrove, meanwhile, had gone rigid, his hands trembling as he raised them in surrender. I didn't do anything," he stammered, his voice cracking. "You've got it all wrong." "Then you won't mind explaining the blood on your windowsill," I said, inching forward. "And while you're at it, You can tell me why Emily's necklace ended up in your possession. Hargrove's voice faltered, and for a moment, I thought he might pass out. His eyes darted from me to the window, then to the hallway behind him. My gut told me there was more to this than he was letting on. Move, and I swear you'll regret it, I warned, keeping my gun steady. Hargrove froze, but his breathing grew ragged. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, he muttered, almost to himself. She wasn't supposed to be home. What did you just say? My tone hardened, though my pulse quickened. Clara had been right. This wasn't just a hunch. This man knew something. I didn't kill her, Hargrove blurted, his voice rising in panic. I swear I didn't. I only took the necklace. She was already dead when I found her. Found her? I snapped. Start talking, Hargrove, and don't leave anything out. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like it might choke him. I came by to borrow some money. Emily was always kind, always helped out when I was short. But when I got there, the door was open, and she was lying there. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. So you stole from her? I asked, disgusted. You found her dead and decided to rob her? I was scared, he shouted, tears streaming down his face now. I didn't want to get blamed. The necklace was sitting on the counter. I grabbed it and ran. That's all, I swear. I stared him down, trying to sift through the lies and half-truths. His story didn't exonerate him. It only raised more questions. If you didn't kill her, who did? I don't know, he sobbed. But there was someone else there. I heard footsteps upstairs when I ran out. I didn't look back, I couldn't. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Did you recognize the footsteps? Did you see anyone? No, I didn't see anything, he said quickly. But I think it was a man. Heavy steps, bigger than Emily. I lowered my gun but didn't relax. You're coming with me, Hargrove. If you're lying, I'll make sure you rot in a cell. By the time we got back to the station, backup had arrived, and forensics was en route to Hargrove's house to examine the blood smear. Clara, who had been silent during the drive, finally spoke as I parked the car. If he's telling the truth, someone else was there that night, she said, her voice low. Someone we missed. I nodded, my mind already spinning. The case wasn't just cold. It had been mishandled from the start. And now, 12 years later, the real killer might still be out there. But who? And why had they stayed silent all this time? As I stepped out of the car, I glanced at Clara. You've got a knack for trouble, you know that? She smirked, though her eyes betrayed her nerves. And you've got a knack for solving it, detective. Let's see if you still remember how. Inside the station, Hargrove was led to an interrogation room, his nerves unraveling by the second. Clara and I huddled over the case files in my office, piecing together what we knew. Let's say Hargrove's telling the truth, Clara said, flipping through the photos. He panicked and stole the necklace, but someone else was there. Someone who wasn't scared enough to run. Then they had a reason to stay, I said, my eyes narrowing. Maybe they were cleaning up loose ends. Maybe they were looking for something. I leaned back, my mind racing. Emily's case had always bothered me, even if I hadn't admitted it out loud. It had wrapped up too neatly, too quickly. A shaky confession from Lane, no physical evidence, and a lack of follow-up on key leads. It stank of convenience. What about her family? Clara asked. Anyone who might have wanted her out of the way. Jealousy, money, something? Her parents were clean, I said, recalling the file. No history of trouble. Her friends all vouched for her, too. But her boss, I trailed off as a memory surfaced. She worked at a small publishing house. Her boss, Peter Alden, was interviewed but never pursued. He had an alibi, claimed he was out of town the night she died. Clara's eyes lit up. What kind of boss was he? Any history of problems? Nothing official, but there were rumors, I admitted. Emily's friends mentioned he had a temper. A few co-workers said he was overly hands-on. But with his alibi, we didn't have anything to hold him on. Let's revisit that alibi, Clara said. 12 years is a long time. People slip up. I made the call, pulling up Alden's file. His alibi had been a business trip to Chicago, corroborated by hotel records. But when I reached out to the hotel, I hit pay dirt. No record of Peter Alden staying here, the receptionist said. Not in the last 15 years. My gut twisted. Are you sure? He would have checked in under his name, or maybe his company. Positive, the receptionist said. I can double-check, but our records are pretty thorough. I hung up and turned to Clara, who was watching me intently. Alden lied. Her jaw tightened. Then he's our guy. He must have been at the scene that night. We need to prove it, I said. If he's our killer, he's been walking free for over a decade. He won't trip easily. We pulled Alden's address. He was still local, living in a gated community across town. Clara wanted to join me, but this time, I insisted she stay behind. If Alden was as dangerous as I suspected, I didn't want her in harm's way. Alden's house was immaculate, a stark contrast to Hargrove's crumbling shack. The lawn was trimmed to perfection, the kind of place where everything seemed too perfect to be real. I knocked on the door, and when Alden answered, his polished appearance and easy smile didn't fool me. "Detective Thorne," I said, flashing my badge. "I'd like to ask you a few questions about Emily Price." His smile faltered, just for a second. "Emily? That was a long time ago. I thought the case was closed." "Funny thing about old cases," I said, stepping inside uninvited. "Sometimes they come back to haunt you." His jaw tightened, but he gestured for me to sit in the living room. "What's this about, detectives?" I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "Your alibi. The hotel you claimed to stay at in Chicago. They've got no record of you being there." Alden froze, the mask of confidence slipping. "That's ridiculous," he said, though his voice wavered. "There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake," I said, my voice low. "You weren't in Chicago. You were here. At Emily Price's apartment." His face drained of color. I don't know what you're talking about." I stood, looming over him. "You killed her, didn't you? She was going to expose you. Maybe she threatened to go to HR, or worse, the police. So you followed her home, waited until she was alone, and you strangled her. Then you let an innocent man take the fall." Alden shot to his feet, his calm demeanor shattering. "You can't prove anything," he hissed. "You have no evidence, no witnesses." "Nothing. Not yet," I said, my voice like steel. "But we will. And when we do, I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life paying for what you did." As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Backup had arrived, along with a warrant to search Alden's home. Forensics combed through the place, and it didn't take long to find what we needed. A box hidden in his attic, containing Emily's missing belongings, including a journal. The final entry in her journal detailed her fears about Alden, how he had made unwanted advances, how she was planning to report him. It was damning evidence, and when confronted with it, Alden cracked. "I didn't mean to," he shouted, his hands trembling as officers cuffed him. "She was going to ruin me. I just wanted to scare her, but she fought back. It was an accident." An accident. That's what they always say. But there was no accident in covering it up, in framing Richard Lane, in letting a killer go free for 12 years. Later that night, I sat in my office, the weight of the case pressing down on me. Clara stepped in, her expression a mix of triumph and exhaustion. "Lane's going to be exonerated," she said softly. "It's over." "Not for him," I said. 12 years of his life gone. "You don't get that back." "But you made it right," Clara said. "You didn't give up." I met her gaze and nodded. "Neither did you." As she left, I picked up Emily's photo, staring at her smiling face. Justice had been served, but it came far too late. I promised myself I wouldn't let it happen again. Some cases might go cold, but as long as I was breathing, they'd never be forgotten.